American Girl Read-Alouds, to Chapter 2 of Meet Kaya. Today, before I begin reading, I'm going to show you Kaya's teepee. The teepee that I have is quite old. It was one of the early editions, and it actually went on this platform base that goes like that. But since it's been around for a really long time, all of the poles that went into these holes have long broken and been lost. So I decided to make my teepee a little bit more traditional and use sticks. Once upon a time, there was poles that looked like this inside that originally came with it, that looked kind of like fake sticks, plastic sticks. But I'm using real sticks, which does bring about the challenge that they're not straight. And the Nimiipuu people, the Nez Perce people, would have used very straight sticks. Or logs, not even sticks. So it's really interesting how they would put their teepees together. I'm going to try to put a link in my comments or on my page to a video that shows you all kinds of instructions, detailed instructions, and a guy really putting it up the way they would have. The Nimiipuu made several different types of homes. One of them was the teepee, which is what the Plains Indians lived in. Now, the Native Americans in different places in the United States did not make teepees. Not all Native Americans lived in them. They were very different homes depending on what part of the country they lived in, what the weather was like, and what the natural resources around them were like. On the plains, they didn't have a whole lot of wood, so they generally didn't make their teepees completely out of wood. They would use some poles, but then they would use buffalo skin. The Nimiipuu people weren't always Plains Indians, and so they made some of their houses out of tool mats. And in Chapter 1, it mentioned something about tool mats. They would take these kind of tool reeds, these grasses, and dry them and put them together. And that sometimes is what they would put around their teepee poles. Other times they would use buffalo skin. So we'll talk more about the other types of homes that they made and what it was like with tool mats a little bit later. But today I'm going to show you kind of how you'd put this teepee together. American Girl has come out with a newer teepee for Kaya, one that she can actually sit in. This one would have been like a practice teepee for children. When children were young, they were given a smaller version of the teepee so that they could play with it and so that they could learn how to put it together. And this version, the first one American Girl came out with, is supposed to be her practice teepee. So it's not really big enough for her to get in very well, especially with my sticks, which aren't quite as sturdy. So a teepee starts out with a tripod with 3 sticks. They should be, these really tall poles should be much straighter than mine, as I mentioned. But once you put those together, they would use rope or some kind of natural, probably rope made out of animal parts. And I've got just kind of twine here, this raffia stuff that looks a little bit more natural here. So they would start with this tripod, and they would generally have their teepees facing east. And so this would be one part of the door pole here. Once they got their tripod in place, they would put more poles around it for a total of 15 poles. I don't have quite that many. This teepee's a little bit too small for that, so they did not make that many. I don't think they made that many. I forgot to count. But they would then fill in this section here, which would be, so this would be the south section, and they would put 4 poles into this part of the tripod, and they would arrange their poles in a spiral shape. And then they would come over to this section and they would put, I'm going to do this one here, they would put the other side of the door, because this part of our tripod was one part of the door, and they would put another part of the door here, and then they would fill in this section. again in a spiral shape, which when the poles are much straighter than this, it starts to give it more of a spiral effect than mine has. And this one's probably a little too long even. So then they would fill in 4 poles in the back section as well. Always in a spiral shape. Then they would tie their teepee to a really tall pole. Oh, actually, before they did that, they would have a rope that was already tied up here at the start on one of the teepee poles. And they would actually, at this point, like this teepee is now going to be, it's going to be really tall. And so they would have this rope hanging down on the ground, and they would take it and wrap it around a few times in order to make it a little bit more stable. Now they couldn't tie it at the top because that would be too high in the air, but I'm going to go ahead and tie mine here. Tie it off a little bit. Then they would have their canvas, their buffalo hide. This is canvas, that's what we use today, but they would use buffalo hide, and it would take quite a few of them. I think 30 to 40 buffalo hide. And then they would pull up this pole that had the buffalo hide tied to it, and then they would pull the buffalo hide around like this. Now they would actually tie some posts in a ladder shape on the front here so that they could get up high to put in the little pins that would hold it together. Mine, I don't have to climb a ladder, but they would make their pins out of animal parts, probably bones and things, and they would push it through to secure it like that. Push it through the holes to secure it like that. These 2 flaps here up at the top are called the smoke flaps, and they would have poles tied to them as well. You can see they've got little things here to tie them. That way they could pull the smoke flaps back to let smoke out, because they would have a fire right inside the teepee to keep them warm. Or if it was snowing or raining, they could use the poles to close those flaps, and this would be fairly tight up here so that they could keep out rain and keep out snow. So they would fill the inside with tulle mats and with animal skins. So it would be nice and cozy inside. We'll see some pictures in the story. I think the chapter today and some other chapters show what the inside looked like, and they made it nice and cozy inside. But right now you can see there's not really a door there. And some of the teepees actually had more of a circular shaped door opening, and then there would be more of the buffalo hide below here that you would actually pin together with more of those. But what they did in order to keep air out and to have a door, an American Girl doesn't have this on their teepees, but they would have another buffalo skin cloth that they would tie on the outside here to the poles, and then it would come up on the inside about 5 feet up the sides of the walls. That way, if any cold air got in, it would go between this layer and the other layer, and so the air would be sent up instead of straight into where they were to make them cold. It would be sent straight up out the teepee top, and so therefore it would make them cold. So my teepee definitely needs a few more poles here to make it help hold its shape better. Let's scoot that one there. So they would have a fire inside in the middle that would keep their houses warm. And they really had just an ingenious way of keeping it warm, letting cold air out, being able to let cool air in during the summer. So it's really fascinating if you study more about the teepees. But this is my rudimentary Kaya's teepee here. This again would have been the play teepee that she would have practiced, because you can see she's about as tall as the teepee. So then, like I said, the new American Girl teepee is tall enough for her to really sit in. This one, we'll just have her sit in front today. So last time Kaya had gotten a little bit carried away with bragging about her horse, and she had been dared to race her horse even though she knew she was not supposed to. And then instead of watching her brothers, she left them with her blind sister. And her blind sister may or may not have been able to watch them very well. So at the very end of the story, last time, she was running back to try and get home and see how her brothers were and her sister was. So this chapter is called Switchings. Kaya ran along the riverbank, past women cleaning salmon and cutting the fish into thin strips. Auntie was laying the strips on racks to dry. She raised her hand in greeting when Kaya rushed by, but Kaya kept going. She ran up to some girls setting up a little camp for their buckskin dolls. They'd made a travois with sticks and pieces of an old tool mat. A boy pretended to be their horse pulling the travois. Have you seen Speaking Rain and my brothers? Kaya asked. The children shook their heads, and Kaya ran on, desperate to find them. The twins had never been like other little boys. They could understand each other without saying a word out loud. When they were born, the setting sun and the rising moon were both in the sky. Two lights in the sky, and two babies who looked alike. They were special children. They could also be twice the trouble if they decided to play tricks. Kaya ran through some brush and out onto the grassy bank where she'd last seen Speaking Rain with the boys. Speaking Rain crouched by a twisted pine tree, but the twins were nowhere in sight. Where are the boys? Kaya called. I don't know, Speaking Rain said, but I just found the toy I made for them. She held up a little hoop of grass. They got tired of my game and ran off. I've been calling them, but they don't answer. Her cloudy eyes grew wide with alarm. Maybe they fell in the river. Kaya caught her breath. Did you hear a splash? Speaking Rain shook her head. But where could they be? Maybe a cougar chased them. Cougars? Cougars sometimes went after small children. Kaya's heart raced, but she tried not to let Speaking Rain feel her alarm. Come on, let's look for the boys. If they just ran off, they can't be far. She made herself sound confident, but she was frightened. The boys could be hurt or lost. Oh, why hadn't she thought of them instead of herself? Kaya looked around. Two trails led away from the riverbank. One turned upstream toward where the women worked. The other turned downstream. Dust-covered leaves hung low over that trail. The little boys probably would have been drawn to that leafy tunnel. Boys! Kaya called. Where are you? There was no answer. Follow me, Kaya said to Speaking Rain. I'll look and you listen. Speaking Rain took hold of Kaya's sleeve and walked right behind her down the trail. I see their footprints in the dust, Kaya said. She walked faster. And here's where they left the trail and went under the bushes. They were crawling. We'll have to crawl too. Stay close. The girls got down on their hands and knees and inched forward. Leaves caught in their braids and brushed their cheeks. Kaya kept a lookout for the stick people hiding in the shadows. Maybe they'd led the boys deeper into the woods. A little farther on, the prince disappeared. Kaya sat back on her heels. I've lost their trail. Do you hear anything? Speaking Rain lifted her chin and frowned. I hear the river. There's swift water there. If the boys fell in, they'd be swept away. Kaya put her hand on Speaking Rain's shoulder. Let's keep looking, she said. She began to search for Prince again. I think we should get others to help, Speaking Rain said. Then she pointed up. Listen, I hear something up there. Kaya got to her feet so that she could see over the bushes. An old spruce tree loomed overhead. A cougar might be crouching in the branches. Or the boys. She'd been so busy following signs on the ground that she'd forgotten the twins could climb trees. A spruce branch trembled. Two pairs of dark eyes gazed down at her from the green boughs. The boys were clinging to the trunk like raccoons, and they were grinning. Kaya was flooded with relief. She was also angry that the boys had scared her and Speaking Rain. Come down right now, she said. The little boys crept down out of the tree in a shower of dry needles. When they reached the ground, they started to giggle. Kaya took their hands and crouched to look into their eyes. Don't laugh, she said. Running off isn't a game. Dangers are everywhere. Yes, dangers are everywhere, a low voice said. Startled, Kaya and Speaking Rain turned. Someone was coming through the woods behind them. Hands parted the branches and Auntie stepped through. Her face was stern. When you ran by me, I sensed trouble, so I followed you, she said. Now I see I was right. I heard your mother tell you to look after your brothers, but you ran away from your responsibility. Kaya felt her face redden. She bit her lips. Auntie's words made her ache with shame. I'm sorry, she whispered. You should be sorry, Auntie said in a weary voice. I must call Whip Woman to teach you a lesson. As Kaya followed Auntie back to the camp, she kept a strong hold on her feelings so that they wouldn't show, but her eyes stung with unshed tears. She kept her gaze on her feet when Auntie went to fetch Whip Woman, the respected elder selected to discipline children who misbehaved. When Whip Woman arrived, she carried a bundle of switches. But it wasn't the switches that Kaya dreaded. It was the bad opinion of the other children. When one child misbehaved, all the children were disciplined. They learned that what one of them did affected all the rest. Come here, children, Whip Woman called out. Come here now. One by one, the children old enough to be switched came forward and lined up in front of Whip Woman. She laid her bundle of willow switches on the ground at her feet. Lie down on your stomachs and bare your legs, Whip Woman told them. She waited while everyone did as she said. Kaya laid down, pulled her skirt up to her knees, and pressed her mouth to the back of her hand. She heard the switch hiss through the air and felt it sting her bare legs. She winced, but she didn't cry out or make a sound. Whip Woman moved on to Speaking Rain, then to the next child. On and on she went until they'd all been given a switching. As the children lay there, Whip Woman spoke to them slowly and firmly. Kaya didn't watch out for her brothers. They ran off into the woods. They could have been injured. Enemies could have carried them away. A magpie that thinks only of itself would have given the boys better care than Kaya did. Nimiipuu always look out for each other. Our lives depend on it. Don't ever forget that, children. Now get up. When Kaya lifted her head, she caught sight of her parents and grandparents looking on. Their sad faces hurt her much more than the stings on her legs. Foxtail got to his knees near Kaya. He grimaced as he rubbed his legs. Magpie, he whispered to her. I'm going to call you Magpie. Magpie, Magpie, echoed the girl next to him. Speaking Rain inched closer to Kaya and clasped her hand. Don't mind them, Speaking Rain said. It's all over now. But it wasn't over, Kaya thought with alarm. Magpie? Is Magpie going to be my nickname? Will they never let me forget this? These fish need to be prepared, Kaya's grandmother said to her. Hold these sticks and give them to me as I need them. It was later that day, and Allah was preparing a welcome meal for Kaya's family. She knelt on a tool mat with several salmon in front of her. She was ready to cut up the salmon and place wooden skewers in the pieces so that they could be set by the fire to roast. Other women had dug deep pits to bake camas bulbs in. The delicious scent of roasting food filled the air. Kaya was glad to be at her grandmother's side. Her head still buzzed with all the trouble she'd caused. Her problems had started with her beloved horse. I raced steps high, but she tried to buck me off, Kaya confessed. Allah muttered. She slid her knife up the belly of a salmon, cut off its head, took out its innards, and began to cut the rest into 3 long pieces. Her face shone with sweat from the heat of the fire. Her hands glistened with oil from the rich salmon. One by one, Kaya handed skewers to Allah. But I'm going to train her, Kaya said, thinking out loud. Someday I'm going to be the very best horsewoman. When she heard herself boast again, she bit her lip. Allah muttered again. She laced a skewer through a large piece of fish. I've lived a long time, and I've known many fine horsewomen. First, they cared for their families. Then they trained their horses. You must think of others before yourself. She held out her hand for another skewer. Kaya bowed her head at her grandmother's lecture. She felt a tear run down her nose. What's wrong? Allah asked. She laid aside a piece of fish and reached for the next one. Some children are calling me Magpie. They say I'm no more trustworthy than a thieving bird, Kaya said miserably. Nicknames, Allah said. Have I ever told you the awful nickname I got when I was your age? Her hands never stopped moving as she spoke. Kaya shook her head. She couldn't imagine her grandmother doing anything to earn an awful nickname. Finger cakes, that's what I was called, Allah said. Finger cakes. Kaya couldn't help but smile. Women ground up coos roots and shaped the mixture into loaves or little finger cakes to dry. Everyone liked dried coos cakes. That's a funny nickname, Kaya said. Why did they call you that? Her grandmother picked up another large salmon. My mother used to put a few finger cakes into my big brother's shoulder bag, she said. If he got hungry when he was hunting, he'd chew on the finger cakes. I was jealous that he got extra pieces of my favorite food, so sometimes, when he wasn't looking, I'd steal some of his finger cakes. One day he caught me with my hand in his bag. From then on, I was called Finger Cakes. Did they call you that for a long time? Kaya asked. Yes, I was Finger Cakes for a long time, Allah said. Every time I heard that nickname, I remembered I'd been wrong to steal my brother's food. Every time I heard that nickname, I vowed I'd never again take what wasn't mine. It was a strict teacher, that nickname. But you lost the nickname, didn't you? Kaya said. Her grandmother smiled. Let me tell you something. Sometimes an old friend will call me Finger Cakes just to tease me. After all these years, that name still pricks me like a thorn. She put down her knife and wiped her hands on the grass. These salmon are ready to roast now. Kaya was still troubled. Do you think I can lose my name, Allah? She asked. Her grandmother looked closely at Kaya. Her dark eyes seemed to see right into Kaya's heart. Listen to me, Allah said. You are not a little girl any longer. You're growing up. Soon, you'll prepare to go on your vision quest to see your Wayakin. Work hard to learn your lessons so your nickname won't trouble you. Then your thoughts will be clear when the time comes for your vision quest. She pushed herself up from her knees. These fish need to be carried to the fire. Everyone is hungry. Kaya's family gathered beside their teepee for their evening meal. Allah had laid several tool mats down in a row on the grass. The men took their places on one side of the mats. The women set wooden bowls of salmon and baked kamas in the center and served the men. Then the women sat down across from them. Kaya's grandfather led them in giving thanks to Hun Yatwa, the Creator. Kalutsa held out his hand over the feast. Are you paying attention, children? He asked in his deep voice. Ahey, Kaya said with the other children. Hun Yatwat made this earth, Kalutsa said. He made Nimiipuu and all people. He made all living things on the earth. He made the water and placed the fish in it. He made the sky and placed birds in it. He created food for all his creatures. We respect and give thanks for his creations. After they all sang a blessing, each one took a sip of water, which sustains all life. Then they all took a tiny bite of salmon, grateful that the fish had given themselves to Nimiipuu for food. After that, Kalutsa motioned for the rest of the food to be passed. So many Native American tribes gave thanks before they ate to the Creator, and they would even thank the animals that died to give them food and to give them buffalo hides and things. They would thank the animals for providing life for them. And they were very careful to use all parts of the animals that they killed, even the bones and the fat. They used it for all sorts of things. As Kaya ate, she glanced from time to time at the others. She was surrounded by her grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, and all the children in her family. She gazed at her father with his sharp cheekbones and broad shoulders. She looked at her mother with her shining black hair and her straight brows. Kaya felt how much she loved them all and how much she needed them. She wanted to be worthy of their trust, to be a girl no one would call Magpie ever again. It is morning, we are alive. The sun is witnessed to what we do today, the camp crier called. He made his way among the teepees to waken everyone and announce the events of that day. Kaya opened her eyes, Itza was already awake. She'd brought a horn bowl of fresh water from the river. Ala was awake too. She stood in the doorway of the teepee and faced the east, where the dawn sky glowed pink. With her eyes closed and her chin lifted, Ala sang a prayer of thanksgiving to Hun Yawat, thanking him for a good night's sleep and the new day. Kaya silently joined Ala's prayer. Morning prayer songs were rising from all the teepees in the camp. The prayers over, Kaya stretched and yawned. Beside her, speaking rain rolled onto her back and reached for her folded dress. The twins were sitting on the deerskin blanket they shared. They held out their hands for the root cakes Brown Deer offered them. Brown Deer had arisen before the camp crier passed by too. Although Kaya hoped to be as hard-working and generous as her older sister, right now Kaya wanted to stay curled up under her soft deerskin as long as possible. Ala turned with a smile as if she guessed Kaya's thought. "Come, girls, get up," she said. "Roll up your bedding. It's time to bathe in the river." Every single morning of the year, in cold weather as well as warm, all the children went into the river to bathe. The cold water made them strong and healthy. Grandmothers and whipwomen watched the children to make sure they got clean. This morning, Kaya delighted in wading into the quiet place at the river bend. A salmon tickled her toes as she walked out on the pebbly bottom to where the water reached her chest. As she splashed, the sun rose over Mount Syringa and flooded light into the green valley. Rabbit, a girl older than Kaya, ducked underwater and came up next to her. She shook drops from her gleaming hair and gave Kaya a sly smile. "I didn't know magpies could swim," she whispered. Kaya's cheeks burned. "I can swim, and faster than you," she said. "Will you peck if you catch me?" Rabbit laughed. With strong strokes she began to swim for shore. Kaya swam after her. She could almost touch Rabbit's flashing heels, but she couldn't catch up to her. Kaya waded out of the river with her head bent. "Magpie didn't win that race," Rabbit said with a grin. "Oh, that nickname stung like a hornet. I let myself boast again," Kaya realized with dismay as she dressed. Kaya returned to their teepee, where she found her parents talking and laughing quietly together as Itza braided Tota's thick black hair. When Itza had tied his braids together, Tota beckoned to Kaya. "Let's go work with your horse," he said. Tota kept his best stallion, Runner, tethered on a long rope near the camp. He put a horsehair rope on Runner's lower jaw and mounted him bareback. That means with no saddle. He handed Kaya another rope bit and a long rope to carry. Then he lifted her up behind him on the big horse, and they set out toward the herd. Kaya loved to ride with her father. She leaned against his warm back. The smooth gait of Tota's stallion rocked them gently. "Tota, Steps High tried to buck me off yesterday," she said. "I thought so," Tota said. "I saw you walking her. If you hadn't had trouble, you'd have been riding." "I know your horse would never buck you," Kaya said. Tota was quiet for a little while. "Have I told you about the first time my father put me on a horse?" he said. "You never told me that," Kaya said. "I was a little boy, even younger than your brothers," Tota said. "One day my father put me on the gentle old horse my grandmother rode. He told me to ride around the camp slowly. But after I went around slowly, I wanted to go faster. I kicked the horse as I'd seen my grandmother do. The horse bolted. My father chased us, yelling to me to turn the horse uphill to slow him. I looked for a soft spot and jumped off into the grass instead. Were you hurt, Tota? Kaya asked. I was sore all over, he said. Do you know why I told you that story today? Why, Tota? Kaya asked. I want you to know that no one is born knowing how to ride, he said, and you have to respect the horse you're riding. It takes a lot of work to learn what we need to know in this life. Tota swung Runner alongside a group of mares. Steps High was grazing with them. Whistle for your horse, he told Kaya. She knows your whistle. When Steps High heard Kaya's whistle, she pricked up her ears. As she came forward, Tota tossed a rope around her neck and drew her close. Each time Kaya saw Steps High, she marveled at her horse's beauty. Steps High was both graceful and strong, the muscles rippling under her skin. Tota got off his stallion and lifted Kaya down. As he approached Steps High, she tossed her small head and rolled her eyes. Tota put the rope bit in her mouth, then grabbed a handful of mane as he swung onto her back. He held the rope reins firmly as he rode her away from the herd at a trot. Steps High pranced nervously, but she obeyed Tota. He drew the horse to a halt again by Kaya. Now it's your turn, he said. You're a strong rider. If you need me, I'm here to help. Kaya swung up onto her horse. Tota handed her the reins, but Kaya didn't urge Steps High forward. I won't push you too fast or too hard again, she whispered to her horse. I want you to trust me. Kaya pressed her knees to her horse's sides. She could feel a shiver run down her horse's back as Steps High began to walk. Steps High pushed against the bit as if she were thinking about running and bucking again, but she stayed at a walk until Kaya nudged her to a trot. Kaya kept her horse gathered in and rode in slow circles until Tota motioned for her to come back to him. He took her horse's reins in one hand and stroked Steps High's neck. Tots, he said to Kaya. That's just how you must ride her for a long time. Stay slow and stay in control. Work with her a little longer, then come back to camp. Tota turned Runner and rode off. As Kaya rode her horse in another circle, Foxtail rode up beside her. He'd been helping some older boys with the horses. His face was dusty and his lips were dry. Herding was hard work in the hot sun. Do you want to race again? He asked Kaya. Tota said I can't race my horse for a long time, Kaya said. Foxtail's grin was a wicked one. I forgot that magpies don't race, he cried. He kicked his horse and galloped away from her. Oh, that nickname again. It gave Kaya a sick feeling in her stomach. She clenched her teeth as she circled Steps High back to the herd. And that's the end of the chapter. So this time, Kaya was not tricked, convinced that she should race her horse against her father's instructions. Sounds like she learned her lesson. It seems really harsh to us that all the children in the tribe would be punished for one child's misbehavior. That even Speaking Rain, who had tried to help Kaya and watch the boys, was punished. And to be switched is a really awful punishment that we don't tend to use anymore. But life was very hard back in Native American times, long time ago. And people died. If Kaya didn't watch her little brothers, they could have died. They could have been captured by enemies, they could have been eaten by a cougar, or drowned in a river. And so parents had to be very, very strict with their children. And tribes had to make sure all their people, especially all of their children, worked together because their lives depended on it. So it was a very different time, but it was also very touching how her grandmother tried to make her feel better by telling her the story of her own nickname from something she had done wrong as a child. And her father shared a story when he wasn't such a great horse rider and got her right back up on her horse again, encouraging her to try more. So although the Nimiipuu people were very strict, they also were very caring about their people. So poor Kaya is going to have to live with the magpie nickname for a while. Hopefully in the next chapter things will get a little bit better. Maybe her horse will begin to trust her again. So tune in next time for more Kaya. See you then.